Voices beyond pages. This is Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Tale of Tinuviel. 2 children had Tinwelint then, Daeron and Tinuviel. And Tinuviel was a maiden, and the most beautiful of all the maidens of the hidden elves, and indeed few have been so fair, for her mother was Fay, a daughter of the gods. But Daeron was then a boy, strong and merry, and above all things he delighted to play upon a pipe of reeds or other woodland instruments, and he is named now among the 3 most magic players of the elves, and the others are Tinfang Warble and Ivare, who plays beside the sea. But Tinuviel's joy was rather in the dance, and no names are set with hers for the beauty and subtlety of her twinkling feet. Now it was the delight of Daeron and Tinuviel to fare away from the cavernous palace of Tinwelint, their father, and together spend long time amid the trees. There often would Daeron sit upon a tussock or a tree root and make music, while Tinuviel danced thereto, and when she danced to the playing of Daeron, more lissome was she than Gwyndoling, more magical than Tinfang Warble neath the moon. Nor may any see such lilting, save be it only in the rose gardens of Valinor, where Nessa dances on the lawns of never-fading green. Even at night, when the moon shone pale still, would they play and dance, and they were not afraid, as I should be, for the rule of Tinwelint and of Gwyndoling held evil from the woods, and Melko troubled them not as yet, and men were hemmed beyond the hills. Now the place that they loved the most was a shady spot, and elms grew there, and beech too. But these were not very tall, and some chestnut trees there were, with white flowers, but the ground was moist, and a great misty growth of hemlocks rose beneath the trees. On a time of June they were playing there, and the white umbels of the hemlocks were like a cloud under the boles of the trees. And there Tinuviel danced until the evening faded late, and there were many white moths abroad. Tinuviel, being a fairy, minded them not, as many of the children of men do, although she loved not beetles, and spiders will none of the Eldar touch, because of unwilliante. But now the white moths flitted above her head, and Daeron trilled an eerie tune, when suddenly that strange thing befell. Never have I heard how Beren came thither over the hills. Yet was he braver than most, as thou shalt hear, and 'twas the love of wandering, maybe alone, that had sped him through the terrors of the Iron Mountains until he reached the lands beyond. Now, Beren was a gnome, son of Egnor the forester, who hunted in the darker places in the north of Hisulume. Dread and suspicion was between the Eldar and those of their kindred which had tasted the slavery of Melko. And in this did the evil deeds of the gnomes at the haven of the swans revenge itself. Now the lies of Melko ran among Beren's folk so that they believed evil things of the secret elves. Yet now did he see Tinuviel dancing in the twilight, and Tinuviel was in a silver pearly dress, and her bare white feet were twinkling among the hemlock stems. Then Beren cared not whether she were Valar, or elf, or child of men, and crept near to see. And he leant against a young elm that grew upon a mound, so that he might look down into the little glade where she was dancing, for the enchantment made him faint. So slender was she, and so fair, that at length he stood heedlessly in the open, the better to gaze upon her. And at that moment the full moon came brightly through the boughs, and Daeron caught sight of Beren's face. Straightway did he perceive that he was none of their folk, and all the elves of the woodland thought of the gnomes of Dolomin as treacherous creatures, cruel and faithless. Wherefore Daeron dropped his instrument in crying, "Flee, flee, O Tinuviel! An enemy walks this wood!" He was gone swiftly through the trees. Then Tinuviel, in her amaze, followed not straightway, for she understood not his words at once, and knowing she could not run nor leap so hardly as her brother, she slipped suddenly down among the white hemlocks, and hid herself beneath a very tall flower with many spreading leaves. And here she looked in her white raiment like a spatter of moonlight shimmering through the leaves upon the floor. Then Beren was sad, for he was lonely, and was grieved at their fright. And he looked for Tinuviel everywhere about, thinking her not fled. Thus suddenly did he lay his hand upon her slender arm beneath the leaves, and with a cry she started away from him and flitted as fast as she could in the wan light, darting and wavering in the moonbeams as only the Eldar can, in and about the tree trunks and the hemlock stalks. The tender touch of her arm made Beren yet more eager than before to find her, and he followed swiftly, and yet not swiftly enough, for in the end she escaped him, and reached the dwellings of her father in fear, nor did she dance alone in the woods for many a day after. And this was a great sorrow to Beren, who would not leave those places, hoping to see that fair elven maiden dance yet again, and he wandered in the wood, growing wild and lonely for many a day in searching for Tinuviel. By dawn and dusk he sought her, but ever more hopefully when the moon shone bright. At last, one night, he caught a sparkle far off, and lo! there she was, dancing alone on a little treeless knoll, and Daeron was not there. Often and often she came thereafter, and danced and sang to herself, and sometimes Daeron would be nigh. And then Beren watched from the wood's edge afar, and sometimes he was away, and Beren crept in closer. Indeed, for long Tinuviel knew of his coming, and feigned otherwise, and for long her fear had departed by reason of the wistful hunger of his face lit by the moonlight, and she saw that he was kind and in love with her beautiful dancing. Then Beren took to following Tinuviel secretly through the woods, even to the entrance of the cave and the bridge's head, and when she was gone in, he would cry across the stream, softly saying, "Tinuviel," for he had caught the name from Daeron's lips. And although he knew it not, Tinuviel often hearkened from within the shadows of the cavernous doors, and laughed softly or smiled. At length one day, as she danced alone, he stepped out more boldly, and said to her, "Tinuviel, teach me to dance." "Who art thou?" she said. "Beren. I am from across the bitter hills." "Then if thou wouldest dance, follow me," said the maiden. And she danced before Beren, away and away into the woods, nimbly, and yet not so fast that he could not follow. And ever and anon she would look back and laugh at him, stumbling after, saying, "Dance, Beren, dance!" as they danced beyond the bitter hills. In this way they came by winding paths to the abode of Tinwelint, and Tinuviel beckoned Beren beyond the stream, and he followed her, wandering down into the cave and the deep halls of her home. When, however, Beren found himself before the king, he was abashed, and of the stateliness of Queen Gwyndoling he was in great awe. And behold, when the king said, "Who art thou that stumbleth into my halls unbidden?" he had naught to say. Tinuviel answered therefore for him, saying, "This, my father, is Beren, a wanderer from beyond the hills, and he would learn to dance as the elves of Artenor can dance." And she laughed, but the king frowned when he heard whence Beren came. And he said, "Put away thy light words, my child, and say, has this wild elf of the shadow sought to do thee any harm?" "Nay, father," said she, "and I think there is not evil in his heart at all. And be thou not harsh with him, unless thou desirest to see thy daughter Tinuviel weep, for more wonder has he at my dancing than any that I have known. Therefore, said Tinwelint now, O Beren, son of the Noldoli, what dost thou desire of the elves of the wood, ere thou returnest whence thou camest?" So great was the amazed joy of Beren's heart when Tinuviel spake thus for him to her father, that his courage rose within him, and his adventurous spirit that had brought him out of Hisolumen over the mountains of iron awoke again. And looking boldly upon Tinwelint, he said, "Why, O king, I desire thy daughter Tinuviel, for she is the fairest and most sweet of all maidens that I have seen or dreamt of." Then there was a silence in the hall, save that Dairon laughed, and all who heard were astounded. But Tinuviel cast down her eyes, and the king, glancing at the wild and rugged aspect of Beren, burst also into laughter, whereat Beren flushed for shame, and Tinuviel's heart was sore for him. Why, wed my Tinuviel, fairest of the maidens of the world, and become a prince of the woodland elves? 'Tis but a little boon for a stranger to ask, quoth Tinwelint. Haply I may with right ask somewhat in return. Nothing great shall it be, a token only of thy esteem. Bring me a Silmaril from the crown of Melko, and that day Tinuviel weds thee, and she will. Then all in that place knew that the king treated the matter as an uncouth jest, having pity on the gnome, and they smiled, for the fame of the Silmarils of Fëanor was now great throughout the world, and the Noldoli had told tales of them, and many that had escaped from Angamondi had seen them now blazing lustrous in the iron crown of Melko. Never did this crown leave his head, and he treasured those jewels as his eyes, and no one in the world, or fey, or elf, or man, could ever hope to set finger even on them and live. This indeed did Beren know, and he guessed the meaning of their mocking smiles, and aflame with anger he cried, "Nay, but 'tis too small a gift to the father of so sweet a bride. Strange none the less seem to me the customs of the woodland elves, like to the rude laws of the folk of men, that thou shouldest name the gift unoffered. Yet lo, I, Beren, a huntsman of the Noldoli, will fulfill thy small desire." And with that he burst from the hall, while all stood astonished. But Tinuviel wept suddenly. "'Twas ill done, O my father," she cried, to send one to his death with thy sorry jesting, for now methinks he will attempt the deed, being maddened by thy scorn, and Melko will slay him, and none will look ever again with such love upon my dancing. Then the king said, 'Twill not be the first of gnomes that Melko hath slain, and for less reason. It is well for him that he lies not bound here in grievous spells for his trespass in my halls, and for his insolent speech. Yet Gwyndoling said naught, neither did she chide Tinuviel, nor question her sudden weeping for this unknown wanderer. Beren, however, going from before the face of Tinwelint, was carried by his wrath far through the woods, until he drew nigh to the lower hills and the treeless lands that warned of the approach of the bleak Iron Mountains. Only then did he feel his weariness and stay his march, and thereafter did his greater travails begin. Nights of deep despondency were his, and he saw no hope whatever in his quest. And indeed there was little. And soon, as he followed the Iron Mountains till he drew nigh to the terrible regions of Melko's abode, the greatest fears assailed him. Many poisonous snakes were in those places, and the wolves roamed about it, and more fearsome still were the wandering bands of the goblins and the orcs, foul broodlings of Melko, who fared abroad doing his evil work, snaring and capturing beasts and men and elves and dragging them to their lord. Many times was Beren near to capture by the orcs, and once he escaped the jaws of a great wolf, only after a combat wherein he was armed but with an ashen club, and other perils and adventures did he know each day of his wandering to Angamandi. Hunger and thirst too tortured him often, and often he would have turned back, had not that been well nigh as perilous as going on. But the voice of Tinuviel pleading with Tinwelint echoed in his heart, and at night time it seemed to him that his heart heard her sometimes weeping softly for him far away in the woodlands of her home. And this was indeed true. One day he was driven by great hunger to search amid a deserted camping of some orcs for scraps of food. But some of these returned unawares and took him prisoner. And they tormented him, but did not slay him, for their captain, seeing his strength, worn through though he was with hardships, thought that Melko might perchance be pleasured if he was brought before him, and might set him to some heavy thrall work in his mines or in his smithies. So came it that Beren was dragged before Melko, and he bore a stout heart within him none the less, for it was a belief among his father's kindred that the power of Melko would not abide forever, but that the Valar would hearken at last to the tears of the Noldoli, and would arise and bind Melko and open Valinor once more to the weary elves, and great joy should come back upon the earth. Melko, however, looking upon him, was wroth, asking how a gnome, a thrall by birth of his, had dared to fare away into the woods unbidden. But Beren answered that he was no runagate, but came of a kindred of gnomes that dwelt in Aryador, and mingled much there among the folk of men. Then was Melko yet more angry, for he sought ever to destroy the friendship and intercourse of elves and men, and said that evidently here was a plotter of deep treacheries against Melko's lordship, and one worthy of the tortures of the Balrogs. But Beren, seeing his peril, answered, "Think not, O most mighty Ainu Melko, lord of the world, that this can be true. For if it were, should I not be here unaided and alone? No friendship has Beren, son of Egnor, for the kindred of men. Nay, indeed, wearying utterly of the lands infested by that folk, he has wandered out of Aryador. Many a great tale has my father made to me aforetime of thy splendour and glory. Wherefore, albeit I am no renegade thrall, I do desire nothing so much as to serve thee in what small manner I may." And Beren said therewith that he was a great trapper of small animals and a snarer of birds, and had become lost in the hills in these pursuits, until, after much wandering, he had come into strange lands, and even had not the orcs seized him, he would indeed have had no other rede of safety but to approach the majesty of Aindu Melko, and beg him to grant him some humble office, as a winner of meats for his table perchance. Now the Valar must have inspired that speech, or perchance it was a spell of cunning words cast on him in compassion by Gwyndoling, for indeed it saved his life. And Melko, marking his hardy frame, believed him, and was willing to accept him as a thrall of his kitchens. Flattery savoured ever sweet in the nostrils of that Ainur, and for all his unfathomed wisdom, many a lie of those whom he despised deceived him. Were they clothed sweetly in words of praise? Therefore now he gave orders for Beren to be made a thrall of Tevildo, prince of cats. Now Tevildo was a mighty cat, the mightiest of all, and possessed of an evil sprite, as some say, and he was in Melko's constant following, and that cat had all cats subject to him, and he and his subjects were the chasers and getters of meat for Melko's table and for his frequent feasts. Wherefore is it that there is hatred still between the elves and all cats, even now when Melko rules no more, and his beasts are become of little account? When therefore Beren was led away to the halls of Tevildo, and these were not utterly distant from the place of Melko's throne, he was much afraid, for he had not looked for such a turn in things, and those halls were ill-lighted, and were full of growling and of monstrous purrings in the dark. All about shone cat's eyes, glowing like green lamps, or red or yellow, where Tevildo's thanes sat waving and lashing their beautiful tails. But Tevildo himself sat at their head, and he was a mighty cat and coal-black and evil to look upon. His eyes were long and very narrow and slanted, and gleamed both red and green, but his great grey whiskers were as stout and as sharp as needles. His purr was like the roll of drums, his growl like thunder. But when he yelled in wrath, it turned the blood cold, and indeed small beasts and birds were frozen as to stone, or dropped lifeless often at the very sound. Now Tevildo, seeing Beren, narrowed his eyes until they seemed to shut, and said, "I smell dog." And he took dislike to Beren from that moment. Now Beren had been a lover of hounds in his own wild home. "Why," said Tevildo, "do ye dare to bring such a creature before me? Unless perchance it is to make meat of him." But those who led Beren said, "Nay, 'twas the word of Melko that his unhappy elf wear out his life as a catcher of beasts and birds in Tevildo's employ." Then indeed did Tevildo screech in scorn, and said, "Then in sooth was my lord asleep, or his thoughts were settled elsewhere. For what use, think ye, is a child of the Eldar to aid the Prince of Cats and his thanes in the catching of birds or of beasts? As well had ye brought some clumsy-footed man, for none are there, either of elves or men, that can vie with us in our pursuit." Nonetheless he set Beren to a test, and he bade him go catch 3 mice, "for my hall is infested with them," said he. This indeed was not true, as might be imagined, yet a certain few there were, a very wild, evil, and magic kind that dared to dwell there in dark holes, but they were larger than rats, and very fierce, and Tevildo harboured them for his own private sport, and suffered not their numbers to dwindle. 3 days did Beren hunt them, but having nothing wherewith to devise a trap, and indeed he did not lie to Melko, saying that he had cunning in such contrivances, he hunted in vain, getting nothing better than a bitten finger for all his labour. Then was Tevildo scornful, and in great anger, but Beren got no harm of him, or his thanes at that time, because of Melko's bidding, other than a few scratches. Evil, however, were his days thereafter in the dwellings of Tevildo. They made him a scullion, and his days passed miserably in the washing of floors and vessels, in the scrubbing of tables, and the hewing of wood, and the drawing of water. Often, too, he would be set to the turning of spits, whereon birds and fat mice were daintily roasted for the cats. Yet seldom did he get food or sleep himself, and he became haggard and unkempt, and wished often that never straying out of Hisolume he had not even caught sight of the vision of Tinuviel. Now that fair maiden wept for a very great while after Beren's departure, and danced no more about the woods, and Dairon grew angry and could not understand her. But she had grown to love the face of Beren peeping through the branches, and the crackle of his feet as they followed her through the wood, and his voice that called wistfully, "Tinuviel, Tinuviel," across the stream, before her father's doors she longed to hear again. And she would not now dance when Beren was fled to the evil halls of Melko, and maybe had already perished. So bitter did this thought become at last, that the most tender maiden went to her mother, for to her father she dared not go, nor even suffer him to see her weep. "O Gwyndoling, my mother," said she, "tell me of thy magic, if thou canst. How doth Beren fare? Is all yet well with him?" "Nay," said Gwyndoling, "he lives indeed, but in an evil captivity, and hope is dead in his heart. For behold, he is a slave, in the power of Tevildo, Prince of Cats." "Then," said Tinuviel, "I must go and succour him, for none else do I know that will." Now Gwyndoling laughed not, for in many matters she was wise, and forewise. Yet it was a thing unthought in a mad dream that any elf, still less a maiden, the daughter of the king, should fare untended to the halls of Melko, even in those earlier days before the Battle of Tears, when Melko's power had not yet grown great, and he veiled his designs, and spread his net of lies. Wherefore did Gwyndoling softly bid her not to speak such folly, but Tinuviel said, "Then must thou plead with my father for aid, that he send warriors to Angamandi, and demand the freedom of Beren from Ainu Melko." This indeed did Gwyndoling do, of love for her daughter, and so wroth was Tinwelint that Tinuviel wished that never had her desire been made known. And Tinwelint bade her nor speak nor think of Beren more, and swore he would slay him and he trod these halls again. Now then Tinuviel pondered much what she might do, and going to Dairon she begged him to aid her, or indeed to fare away with her to Angamandi, and he would. But Dairon thought with little love of Beren, and he said, "Wherefore should I go into the direst peril that there is in the world for the sake of a wandering gnome of the woods? Indeed I have no love for him, for he has destroyed our play together, our music, and our dancing." But Dairon, moreover, told the king of what Tinuviel had desired of him, and this he did not of ill intent, but fearing lest Tinuviel fare away to her death in the madness of her heart. Now when Tinwelint heard this, he called Tinuviel, and said, "Wherefore, O maiden of mine, dost thou not put this folly away from thee, and seek to do my bidding?" But Tinuviel would not answer, and the king bade her promise that neither would she think more on Beren, nor would she seek in her folly to follow after him to the evil lands, whether alone or tempting any of his folk with her. But Tinuviel said that the first she would not promise, and the second only in part, for she would not tempt any of the folk of the woodlands to go with her. Then was her father mightily angry, and beneath his anger not a little amazed and afraid. For he loved Tinuviel, but this was the plan he devised, for he might not shut his daughter forever in the caverns, where only a dim and flickering light ever came. Now above the portals of his cavernous hall was a steep slope falling to the river, and there grew mighty beeches, and one there was named J.R.R, the queen of trees, for she was very mighty, and so deeply cloven was her bole that it seemed as if 3 shafts sprang from the ground together, and they were of like size, round and straight, and their grey rind was as smooth as silk, unbroken by branch or twig, for a very great height above men's heads. Now Tinwelint let build high up in that strange tree, as high as men could fashion their longest ladders to reach, a little house of wood, and it was above the first branches, and was sweetly veiled in leaves. Now that house had 3 corners, and 3 windows in each wall, and at each corner was one of the shafts of J.R.R. There then did Tinwelint bid Tinuviel dwell until she would consent to be wise. And when she fared up the ladders of tall pine, these were taken from beneath, and no way had she to get down again. All that she required was brought to her, and folk would scale the ladders and give her food or whatever else she wished for. And then, descending again, take away the ladders, and the king promised death to any who left one leaning against the tree, or who should try by stealth to place one there at night. A guard, therefore, was set nigh the tree's foot, and yet came J.R.R often thither in sorrow at what he had brought to pass, for he was lonely without Tinuviel. But Tinuviel had at first much pleasure in her house among the leaves, and would gaze out of her little window, while J.R.R made his sweetest melodies beneath. But one night a dream of the Valar came to Tinuviel, and she dreamt of Beren, and her heart said, "Let me be gone to seek him, whom all others have forgot." And waking, the moon was shining through the trees, and she pondered very deeply how she might escape. Now Tinuviel, daughter of Gwyndoling, was not ignorant of magic or of spells, as may well be believed, and after much thought she devised a plan. The next day she asked those who came to her to bring, if they would, some of the clearest water of the stream below. But this, she said, must be drawn at midnight in a silver bowl, and brought to my hand with no word spoken. And after that she desired wine to be brought. But this, she said, must be borne hither in a flagon of gold at noon, and he who brings it must sing as he comes. And they did as they were bid, but Tinwelint was not told. Then said Tinuviel, "Go now to my mother, and say to her that her daughter desires a spinning wheel to pass her weary hours." But J.R.R, secretly, she begged fashion her a tiny loom, and he did this even in the little house of Tinuviel in the tree. "But wherewith will you spin, and wherewith weave?" said he. And Tinuviel answered, "With spells and magics." But J.R.R knew not her design, nor said more to the king, nor to Gwyndoling. Now Tinuviel took the wine and the water when she was alone, and singing a very magic song the while, she mingled them together, as they lay in the bowl of gold. She sang a song of growth, and as they lay in the bowl of silver, she sang another song, and the names of all the tallest and longest things upon earth were set in that song. The beards of the Indravings, the tail of Karkaras, the body of Glorond, the bowl of J.R.R, and the sword of Nan she named. Nor did she forget the chain Angainu that Aule and Tulkas made, or the neck of Gilim the giant. And last and longest of all, she spake of the hair of Uinen, the lady of the sea, that is spread through all the waters. Then did she lave her head with the mingled water and wine, and as she did so she sang a third song. a song of uttermost sleep, and the hair of Tinuviel, which was dark and finer than the most delicate threads of twilight, began suddenly to grow very fast indeed. And after 12 hours had passed, it nigh filled the little room. And then Tinuviel was very pleased, and she lay down to rest, and when she awoke, the room was full as with a black mist, and she was deep hidden under it, and lo! Her hair was trailing out of the windows, and blowing about the tree boles in the morning. Then with difficulty she found her little shears, and cut the threads of that growth nigh to her head, and after that her hair grew only as it was wont before. Then was the labour of Tinuviel begun, and though she laboured with the deftness of an elf, long was the spinning, and longer weaving still. And did any come and hail her from below, did she bid them gone, saying, I am abed, and desire only to sleep. And Dairon was amazed, and called often up to her, but she did not answer. Now of that cloudy hair Tinuviel wove a robe of misty black, soaked with drowsiness, more magical far than even that one that her mother had worn and danced in long ago. And therewith she covered her garments of shimmering white, and magic slumbers filled the air about her. But of what remained she twisted a mighty strand, and this she fastened to the bole of the tree within her house, and then was her labour ended, and she looked out of her window westward to the river. Already the sunlight was fading in the trees, and as dusk filled the woods, she began a song very soft and low, and as she sang, she cast out her long hair from the window, so that its slumberous mist touched the heads and the faces of the guards below, and they, listening to her voice, fell suddenly into a fathomless sleep. Then the Tinuviel, clad in her garments of darkness, slipped down that rope of hair light as a squirrel, and away she danced to the bridge, and before the bridge words could she cry out, she was among them dancing, and as the hem of her black robe touched them they fell asleep, and Tinuviel fled very far away, as fast as her dancing feet would flit. And 'tis said that Dairon, following after her, became utterly lost, and came never back to Elfiness, but turned towards Palisor, and there plays subtle magic music still, wistful and lonely in the woods and forests of the south. Yet ere long as Tinuviel went forward, a sudden dread overtook her at the thought of what she had dared to do and what lay before her. Then did she turn back for a while, and she wept, wishing Dairon were with her, and it is said that he indeed was not far off, but was wandering lost in the great pines, the forest of night, where afterward Turin slew Beleg by mishap. Nigh was Tinuviel now to those places, but she entered not that dark region, and regaining heart pressed on, and by reason of the grace and magic of her being, and because of the spell of wonder and of sleep that fed about her, no such dangers assailed her as did Beren before. Yet was it a long and evil and weary journey for a maiden to tread. Now is it to be told that in those days Tevildo had but one trouble in the world, and that was the kindred of the dogs. Many indeed of these were neither friends nor foes of the cats, for they had become subject to Melko, and were as savage and cruel as any of his animals. Indeed, from the most cruel and most savage he bred the race of wolves, and they were very dear indeed to him. Was it not the great grey wolf, Karkaras Knife Fang, father of wolves, who guarded the gates of Angamandi in those days and long had done so? Many were there, however, who would neither bow to Melko, nor live wholly in fear of him, but dwelt either in the dwellings of men and guarded them from much evil that had otherwise befallen them, or roamed the woods of Hisselume, or passing the mountainous places, fared even at times into the region of Artenor and the lands beyond and to the south. Did ever any of these view Tevildo, or any of his thanes or subjects, then there was a great baying and a mighty chase, and albeit seldom was any cat slain by reason of their skill in climbing and in hiding, and because of the protecting might of Melko, yet was great enmity between them, and some of those hounds were held in dread among the cats. None, however, did Tevildo fear, for he was as strong as any among them, and more agile and more swift, save only than Juan, captain of dogs. So swift was Juan that on a time he had tasted the fur of Tevildo, and though Tevildo had paid him for that with a gash from his great claws, yet was the pride of the prince of cats unappeased, and he lusted to do a great harm to Juan of the dogs. Great, therefore, was the good fortune that befell Tinuviel in meeting with Juan in the woods, although at first she was mortally afraid and fled. But Juan overtook her in 2 leaps, and speaking soft and deep the tongue of the lost elves, he bid her be not afraid. And wherefore, said he, do I see an elven maiden, and one most fair, wandering alone so nigh to the abodes of the Ainu of evil? Knowest thou not these are very evil places to be in, little one? Even with a companion, and they are death to the lonely. That know I, said she, and I am not here for the love of wayfaring, but I seek only Beren. What knowest thou then, said Juan, of Beren, or indeed meanest thou son of Beren of the huntsman of the elves, Egnor Borimion, a friend of mine since very ancient days? Nay, I know not even whether my Beren be thy friend, for I seek only Beren from beyond the bitter hills, whom I knew in the woods near to my father's home. Now is he gone, and my mother, Gwyndoling, says of her wisdom that he is a thrall in the cruel house of Tevildo, prince of cats. And whether this be true, or yet worse be now befallen him, I do not know, and I go to discover him, though plan I have none. Then will I make thee one, said Juan. But do thou trust in me, for I am Juan of the dogs, chief foe of Tevildo. Rest thee now with me a while within the shadows of the wood, and I will think deeply. Then Tinuviel did as he said, and indeed she slept long while Juan watched, for she was very weary. But after a while awakening, she said, Lo, I have tarried over long. Come, what is thy thought, O Juan? And Juan said, Dark and difficult matter is this, and no other rede can I devise but this. Creep now, if thou hast the heart, to the abiding place of that prince while the sun is high, and Tevildo and the most of his household drowse upon the terraces before his gates. There, discover in what manner thou mayst, whether Beren be indeed within, as thy mother said to thee. Now I will lie not far hence in the woods, and thou wilt do me a pleasure, and aid thy own desires, if going before Tevildo, be Beren there, or be he not, thou tellest him how thou hast stumbled upon Juan of the dogs, lying sick in the woods at this place. Do not indeed direct him hither, for thou must guide him, if it may be thyself. Then wilt thou see what I contrive for thee and for Tevildo. Methinks that bearing such tidings, Tevildo will not entreat thee ill within his halls, nor seek to hold thee there. In this way did Juan design both to do Tevildo a hurt, or perchance, if it might so be, to slay him, and to aid Beren, whom he guessed in truth to be that Beren, son of Egnor, whom the hounds of his Silum loved. Indeed, hearing the name of Gwyndoling, and knowing thereby that this maiden was a princess of the woodland fairies, he was eager to aid her, and his heart warmed to her sweetness. Now Tinuviel, taking heart, stole near to the halls of Tevildo, and Juan wondered much at her courage, following unknown to her, as far as he might for the success of his design. At length, however, she passed beyond his sight, and leaving the shelter of the trees, came to a region of long grass dotted with bushes that sloped ever upwards towards a shoulder of the hills. Now upon that rocky spur the sun shone, but over all the hills and mountains at its back a black cloud brooded, for there was Angamandi, and Tinuviel fared on, not daring to look up at that gloom, for fear oppressed her, and as she went the ground rose, and the grass grew more scant, and rocks strewn, until it came even to a cliff, sheer of one side, and there upon a stony shelf was the castle of Tevildo. No pathway led thereto, and the place where it stood fell towards the woods in terrace after terrace, so that none might reach its gates save by many great leaps, and those became ever steeper as the castle drew more nigh. Few were the windows of that house, and upon the ground there were none. Indeed, the very gate was in the air, wherein the dwellings of men are wont to be in the windows of the upper floor, but the roof had many wide and flat spaces open to the sun. Now does Tinuviel wander disconsolate upon the lowest terrace, and looked in dread at the dark house upon the hill, when behold! She came at a bend in the rock upon a lone cat, lying in the sun, and seemingly asleep. As she approached, he opened a yellow eye, and blinked at her, and thereupon rising and stretching, he stepped up to her, and said, "Whither away, little maid? Dost not know that you trespass on the sunning ground of his highness Tevildo and his thanes?" Now Tinuviel was very much afraid, but she made as bold an answer as she was able, saying, "That know I not, my lord." And this pleased the old cat greatly, for he was in truth only Tevildo's doorkeeper. "But I would indeed of your goodness be brought to Tevildo's presence now, nay, even if he sleeps," said she, for the doorkeeper lashed his tail in astonished refusal. "I have words of immediate import for his private ear. Lead me to him, my lord," she pleaded, and thereat the cat purred so loudly that she dared to stroke his ugly head, and this was much larger than her own, being greater than that of any dog that is now on earth. Thus entreated, Umyan, for such was his name, said, "Come then with me," and seizing Tinuviel suddenly by her garments at the shoulder, to her great terror, he tossed her upon his back, and leapt upon the second terrace. There he stopped, and as Tinuviel scrambled from his back, he said, "Well is it for thee that this afternoon my lord Tevildo lieth upon this lowly terrace far from his house, for great weariness and a desire for sleep has come upon me, so that I fear me I should not be willing to carry thee much farther." Now Tinuviel was robed in her robe of sable mist. So saying, Umyan yawned mightily, and stretched himself before he led her along the terrace to an open space, where upon a wide couch of baking stones lay the horrible form of Tevildo himself, and both his evil eyes were shut. Going up to him, the door-cat Umyan spoke in his ear softly, saying, "A maiden awaits thy pleasure, my lord, who hath news of importance to deliver to thee, nor would she take my refusal." Then did Tevildo angrily lash his tail, half opening an eye. "What is it? Be swift," said he, "for this is no hour to come desiring audience of Tevildo, prince of cats." "Nay, lord," said Tinuviel, trembling, "be not angry, nor do I think that thou wilt when thou hearest. Yet is the matter such that it were better not even whispered here, where the breezes blow?" said Tinuviel, cast a glance as it were of apprehension towards the woods. "Nay, get thee gone," said Tevildo. "Thou smellest of dog." And what news of good came ever to a cat from a fairy that had had dealings with the dogs? "Why, sir, that I smell of dogs is no matter of wonder, for I have just escaped from one, and is indeed of a certain very mighty dog, whose name thou knowest that I would speak." Then up sat Tevildo, and opened his eyes, and he looked all about him, and stretched 3 times, and at last bade the door-cat lead Tinuviel within, and Umyan caught her upon his back as before. Now was Tinuviel in the sorest dread, for having gained what she desired, a chance of entering Tevildo's stronghold and maybe of discovering where the Beren were there, she had no plan more, and knew not what would become of her. Indeed, had she been able, she would have fled. Yet now do those cats begin to ascend the terraces towards the castle, and one leap does Umian make bearing Tinuviel upwards, and then another, and at the third he stumbled so that Tinuviel cried out in fear, and Tevildo said, "What ails thee, Umian, thou clumsy foot? It is time that thou left my employ if age creeps on thee so swiftly." But Umian said, "Nay, lord, I know not what it is, but a mist is before my eyes, and my head is heavy." And he staggered as one drunk, so that Tinuviel slid from his back, and thereupon he laid him down, as if in a dead sleep. But Tevildo was wroth, and seized Tinuviel, and none too gently, and himself bore her to the gates. Then, with a mighty leap, he sprang within, and bidding that maiden alight, he set up a yell that echoed fearsomely in the dark ways and passages. Forthwith they hastened to him from within, and some he bid descend to Umian, and bind him and cast him from the rocks on the northern side, where they fall most sheer. "For he is of no use more to me," he said, "for his age has robbed him of his sureness of foot." And Tinuviel quaked to hear the ruthlessness of this beast. But even as he spoke, he himself yawned and stumbled, as with a sudden drowsiness. And he bid others to lead Tinuviel away to a certain chamber within, and that was the one where Tevildo was accustomed to sit at meat with his greatest thanes. It was full of bones, and smelt evilly. No windows were there, and but for one door, but a hatchway gave from it upon the great kitchens, and a red light crept thence, and dimly lit the place. Now so adread was Tinuviel where those catfolk had left her there, that she stood a moment unable to stir, but soon, becoming used to the darkness, she looked about, and spying the hatchway that had a wide sill, she sprang thereto, for it was not over high, and she was a nimble elf. Now gazing therethrough, for it was ajar, she saw the wide vaulted kitchens, and the great fires that burnt there, and those that toiled always within, and the most were cats. But behold, there by a great fire stooped Beren, and he was grimed with labour, and Tinuviel sat and wept, but as yet dared nothing. Indeed, even as she sat, the harsh voice of Tevildo sounded suddenly within that chamber. "Nay, where then in Melko's name has that mad elf fled?" And Tinuviel, hearing, shrank against the wall, but Tevildo caught sight of her, where she was perched, and cried, "Then the little bird sings not any more. Come down, or I must fetch thee, for behold, I will not encourage the elves to seek audience of me in mockery." Then, partly in fear and part in hope that her clear voice might carry even to Beren, Tinuviel began suddenly to speak very loud, and to tell her tale, so that the chambers rang. But, "Hush, dear maiden," said Tevildo. "If the matter were secret without, is not one for bawling within." Then said Tinuviel, "Speak not thus to me, O cat, mighty lord of cats, though thou be, for am I not Tinuviel, princess of fairies, that have stepped out of my way to do thee a pleasure?" Now at those words, and she had shouted them even louder than before, a great crash was heard in the kitchens, as of a number of vessels of metal and earthenware suddenly let fall. But Tevildo snarled, "There trippeth that fool, Beren, the elf. Melko, rid me of such folk." Yet Tinuviel, guessing that Beren had heard, and being smitten with astonishment, put aside her fears, and repented her daring no longer. Tevildo, nonetheless, was very wroth at her haughty words, and had he not been minded first to discover what good he might get from her tale, it had fared ill with Tinuviel straightway. Indeed, from that moment she was in great peril, for Melko and all his vassals held Tinwelint and his folk as outlaws, and great was their joy to ensnare them, and cruelly entreat them, so that much favour would Tevildo have gained, had he taken Tinuviel before his lord. Indeed, so soon as she named herself, this did he propose to do when his own business had been done, but of a truth his wits were drowsed that day, and he forgot to marvel more why Tinuviel sat perched upon the sill of the hatchway, nor did he think more of Beren, for his mind was bent only to the tale Tinuviel bore to him. "Wherefore," said he, dissembling his evil mood, "nay, lady, be not angry, but come. Delay whetteth my desire. What is it that thou hast for my ears? For they twitch already." But Tinuviel said, "There is a great beast, rude and violent, and his name is Huan." And at that name Tevildo's back curved, and his hair bristled and crackled, and the light of his eyes was red. "And," she went on, "it seems to me a shame that such a brute be suffered to infect the woods so nigh, even to the abode of the powerful Prince of Cats, my lord Tevildo." But Tevildo said, "Nor is he suffered, and cometh never there, save it be by stealth." "Howso that may be," said Tinuviel, "there he is now, yet methinks that at last may his life be brought utterly to an end, for lo, as I was going through the woods, I saw where a great animal lay upon the ground, moaning as in sickness, and behold, it was Huan, and some evil spell or malady has him in its grip, and still he lies helpless in a dale not a mile westward in the woods from this hall. Now with this, perhaps, I would not have troubled your ears, had not the brute, when I approached to succour him, snarled upon me, and essayed to bite me, and meseems that such a creature deserves whatever come to him." Now all this that Tinuviel spake was a great lie, in whose devising Huan had guided her. And maidens of the Eldar are not wont to fashion lies, yet have I never heard that any of the Eldar blamed her therein, nor Beren afterward, and neither do I. For Tevildo is an evil cat, and Melko the wickedest of all beings, and Tinuviel was in dire peril at their hands. Tevildo, however, himself a great and skilled liar, was so deeply versed in the lies and subtleties of all the beasts and creatures that he seldom knew whether to believe what was said to him or not, and was wont to disbelieve all things save those that he wished to believe true, and so was he often deceived by the more honest. Now, the story of Huan and his haplessness so pleased him that he was fain to believe it true, and determined at least to test it. Yet at first he feigned indifference, saying this was a small matter for such secrecy, and might have been spoken outside without further ado. But Tinuviel said she had not thought that Tevildo, Prince of Cats, needed to learn that the ears of Huan heard the slightest sounds a league away, and the voice of a cat further than any sound else. Now, therefore, Tevildo sought to discover from Tinuviel, under pretence of mistrusting her tale, where exactly Huan might be found, but she only made vague answers, seeing in this her only hope of escaping from the castle, and at length Tevildo, overcome by curiosity and threatening evil things if she should prove false, summoned 2 of his thanes to him, and one was Oikeroi, a fierce and warlike cat. Then did the 3 set out with Tinuviel from that place. But Tinuviel took off her magical garment of black and folded it, so that for all its size and density it appeared no more than the smallest kerchief, for so she was able. And thus was she borne down the terrace upon the back of Oikeroi without mishap, and no drowsiness assailed her bearer. Now crept they through the woods in the direction she had named, and soon does Tevildo smell dog and bristles, and lashes his great tail. But after he climbs a lofty tree, and looks down from thence into that dale that Tinuviel had shown to them, There he does indeed see the great form of Huan lying prostrate, groaning and moaning, and he comes down in much glee and haste, and indeed in his eagerness he forgets Tinuviel, who now, in great fear for Huan, lies hidden in a bank of fern. The design of Tevildo and his two companions was to enter that dale silently from different quarters, and so come all suddenly upon Huan unawares and slay him. Or, if he were too stricken to make fight, to make sport of him and torment him. This did they now, but even as they leapt out upon him, Huan sprang up into the air with a mighty baying, and his jaws closed in the back close to the neck of that cat Oikeroi, and Oikeroi died. But the other Thane fled howling up a great tree, and so was Tevildo left alone face to face with Huan, and such an encounter was not much to his mind. Yet was Huan upon him too swiftly for flight, and they fought fiercely in that glade, and the noise that Tevildo made was very hideous. But at length Huan had him by the throat, and that cat might have well perished had not his claws, as he struck out blindly, pierced Huan's eye. Then did Huan give tongue, and Tevildo, screeching fearsomely, got himself loose with a great wrench, and leapt up a tall and smooth tree that stood by, even as his companion had done. Despite his grievous hurt, Huan now leaps beneath that tree, baying mightily, and Tevildo curses him and casts evil words upon him from above. Then said Huan, "Lo, Tevildo, these are the words of Huan, whom thou thoughtest to catch, and slay helpless as the miserable mice it is thou wont to hunt. Stay forever up thy lonely tree, and bleed to death of thy wounds, or come down and feel again my teeth. But if neither are to thy liking, then tell me, where is Tinuviel, princess of fairies, and Beren, son of Egnor? For these are my friends. Now, these shall be set as ransom against thee, though it be valuing thee far over thy worth. As for that cursed elf, she lies whimpering in the ferns yonder, and my ears mistake not," said Tevildo. "And Beren, methinks, is being soundly scratched by Miale, my cook, in the kitchens of my castle, for his clumsiness there an hour ago. Oh, then let them be given to me in safety," said Huan, "and thou mayest return thyself to thy halls and lick thyself unharmed." "Of a surety, my Thane, who is here with me, shall fetch them for thee," said Tevildo, but growled Huan, "Aye, and fetch also all thy tribe, and the hosts of the orcs, and the plagues of Melko. Nay, I am no fool. Rather shalt thou give Tinuviel a token, and she shall fetch Beren, or thou shalt stay here if thou likest not the other way." Then was Tevildo forced to cast down his golden collar, a token no cat dare dishonour. But Huan said, "Nay, more yet is needed, for this will arouse all thy folk to seek thee." And this Tevildo knew and had hoped. So was it that in the end weariness and hunger and fear prevailed upon that proud cat, a prince of the service of Melko, to reveal the secret of the cats, and the spell that Melko had entrusted to him. And those were words of magic whereby the stones of his evil house were held together, and whereby he held all beasts of the catfolk under his sway, filling them with an evil power beyond their nature. For long has it been said that Tevildo was an evil fey in beast-like shape. When, therefore, he had told it, Huan laughed till the woods rang, for he knew that the days of the power of the cats were over. Now sped Tinuviel with the golden collar of Tevildo back to the lowest terrace before the gates, and standing she spake the spell in her clear voice. Then behold, the air was filled with the voices of cats, and the house of Tevildo shook, and there came therefrom a host of indwellers, and they were shrunk to puny size, and were afeard of Tinuviel, who, waving the collar of Tevildo, spake before them certain of the words that Tevildo had said in her hearing to Huan, and they cowered before her. But she said, "Lo, let all those of the folk of the elves, or of the children of men, that are bound within these halls be brought forth." and behold, Beren was brought forth. But of other thralls there were none, save only Gimli, an aged gnome, bent in thraldom and grown blind, but whose hearing was the keenest that has been in the world, as all songs say. Gimli came leaning upon a stick, and Beren aided him. But Beren was clad in rags and haggard, and he had in his hand a great knife he had caught up in the kitchen, fearing some new ill when the house shook, and all the voices of the cats were heard. But when he beheld Tinuviel standing amid the host of cats that shrank from her, and saw the great collar of Tevildo, then was he amazed utterly, and knew not what to think. But Tinuviel was very glad, and spoke, saying, "O Beren from beyond the bitter hills, wilt thou now dance with me, and let it not be here?" And she led Beren far away, and all those cats set up a howling and wailing, so that Juan and Tevildo heard it in the woods. But none followed or molested them, for they were afraid, and the magic of Melko was fallen from them. This indeed they rued afterward, when Tevildo returned home, followed by his trembling comrade. For Tevildo's wrath was terrible, and he lashed his tail and dealt blows at all who stood nigh. Now Juan of the dogs, though it might seem a folly, when Beren and Tinuviel came to that glade, had suffered that evil prince to return without further war. But the great collar of gold he had set about his own neck, and at this was Tevildo more angry than all else, for a great magic of strength and power lay therein. Little to Juan's liking was it that Tevildo lived still, but now no longer did he fear the cats, and that tribe has fled before the dogs ever since, and the dogs hold them still in scorn since the humbling of Tevildo in the woods nigh Angamandi. And Juan has not done any greater deed. Indeed, afterward Melko heard all, and he cursed Tevildo and his folk, and banished them. Nor have they since that day had lord nor master nor any friend, and their voices wail and screech, for their hearts are very lonely, and bitter, and full of loss, yet there is only darkness therein, and no kindliness. At the time, however, whereof the tale tells it was Tevildo's chief desire to recapture Beren and Tinuviel and to slay Juan, that he might regain the spell and magic he had lost, for he was in great fear of Melko, and he dared not seek his master's aid, and reveal his defeat and the betrayal of his spell. Unwitting of this, Juan feared those places, and was in great dread lest those doings came swiftly to Melko's ear, as did most things that came to pass in the world. Wherefore now Tinuviel and Beren wandered far away with Juan, and they became great in friendship with him. And in that life Beren grew strong again, and his thraldom fell from him, and Tinuviel loved him. Yet wild and rugged and very lonely were those days, for never a face of elf nor of man did they see, and Tinuviel grew at last to long sorely for Gwyndoling her mother, and the songs of sweet magic she was used to sing to her children as twilight fell in the woodlands by their ancient halls. Often she half fancied she heard the flute of Dairon, her brother, in pleasant glades wherein they sojourned, and her heart grew heavy. At length she said to Beren and to Juan, "I must return home." And now is it Beren's heart that is overcast with sorrow, for he loved the life in the woods with the dogs. For by now many others had become joined to Juan, yet not if Tinuviel were not there. None the less said he, "Never may I go back with thee to the land of Artenor, nor come there ever after to seek thee, sweet Tinuviel, save only bearing a Silmaril, nor may that ever now be achieved. For am I not a fugitive from the very halls of Melko, and in danger of the most evil pains do any of his servants spy me?" Now this he said in the great grief of his heart at parting with Tinuviel, and she was torn in mind, abiding not the thought of leaving Beren, nor yet of living ever thus in exile. So she sat a great while in sad thought, and she spoke not, but Beren sat nigh, and at length said, Tinuviel, one thing only can we do. Go and get a Silmaril. And she thought thereupon Juan, asking his aid and advice, but he was very grave and saw nothing but folly in the matter. Yet in the end Tinuviel begged of him the fell of Oikeroi that he slew in the affray of the glade. Now Oikeroi was a very mighty cat, and Juan carried that fell with him as a trophy. Now doth Tinuviel put forth her skill and fairy magic, and she sews Beren into this fell, and makes him to the likeness of a great cat, and she teaches him how to sit and sprawl, and to step and bound and trot in the semblance of a cat, till Juan's very whiskers bristled at the sight. And thereat Beren and Tinuviel laughed. Never, however, could Beren learn to screech, or wail, or to purr, like any cat that ever walked, nor could Tinuviel awaken a glow in the dead eyes of the catskin. But we must put up with that, said she, and thou hast the very air of a noble cat, if thou but hold thy tongue. Then did they bid farewell to Juan, and set out for the halls of Melko by east journeys. For Beren was in great discomfort and heat within the fur of Oikeroi, and Tinuviel's heart became lighter a while than it had been for long, and she stroked Beren or pulled his tail, and Beren was angry because he could not lash it in answer as fiercely as he wished. At length, however, they drew near to Angamandi, as indeed the rumblings and deep noises and the sound of mighty hammerings of 10,000 smiths labouring unceasingly declared to them. Nigh were the sad chambers where the thrall Noldoli laboured bitterly under the orcs and goblins of the hills, and here the gloom and darkness was great, so that their hearts fell. But Tinuviel arrayed her once more in her dark garment of deep sleep. Now the gates of Angamandi were of iron wrought hideously, and set with knives and spikes, and before them lay the greatest wolf the world has ever seen, even Karkaras Knifefang, who had never slept. And Karkaras growled when he saw Tinuviel approach, but of the cat he took not much heed, for he thought little of cats, and they were ever passing in and out. Growl not, O Karkaras, said she, for I go to seek my lord Melko, and this Thane of Tevildo goeth with me as escort. Now the dark robe veiled all her shivering beauty, and Karkaras was not much troubled in mind, yet none the less he approached, as was his wont, to snuff the air of her, and the sweet fragrance of the Eldar that garment might not hide. Therefore straightway did Tinuviel begin a magic dance, and the black strands of her dark veil she cast in his eyes, so that his legs shook with a drowsiness, and he rolled over and was asleep. But not until he was fast in dreams of great chases in the woods of Hisulume, when he was yet a whelp, did Tinuviel cease, and then did those twain enter that black portal, and winding down many shadowy ways they tumbled at length into the very presence of Melko. In that gloom Beren passed well enough as the very Thane of Tevildo, and indeed Oikeroi had aforetime been much about the halls of Melko, so that none heeded him, and he slunk under the very chair of the Ainu unseen. But the adders and evil things there lying set him in great fear, so that he durst not move. Now all this fell out most fortunately, for had Tevildo been with Melko, their deceit would have been discovered. And indeed of that danger they had thought, not knowing that Tevildo sat now in his halls, and knew not what to do should his discomfiture become noised in Angamandi. But behold, Melko espieth Tinuviel, and saith, Who art thou that flittest about my halls like a bat? How camest thou in? For of a surety thou dost not belong here.
Nay, that I do not yet, saith Tinuviel, though I may perchance hereafter of thy goodness, my lord Melko. Knowest thou not that I am Tinuviel, daughter of Tinwelint the outlaw? For he hath driven me from his halls, for he is an overbearing elf, and I give not my love at his command.
Now in truth was Melko amazed that the daughter of Tinwelint came thus of her free will to his dwelling, Angamandi the Terrible, and suspecting something untoward, he asked what was her desire. For knowest thou not, saith he, that there is no love here for thy father nor his folk, nor needest thou hope for soft words and good cheer from me.
So hath my father said, saith she, but wherefore need I believe him? Behold, I have a skill of subtle dances, and I would dance now before you, my lord, for then methinks I might readily be granted some humble corner of your halls, wherein to dwell until such times as you should call for the little dancer Tinuviel to lighten your cares.
Nay, saith Melko, such things are little to my mind. But as thou hast come thus far to dance, dance, and after we will see. And with that he leered horribly, for his dark mind pondered some evil. Then did Tinuviel begin such a dance as neither she nor any other sprite nor fay nor elf danced ever before or has done since, and after a while even Melko's gaze was held in wonder. Round the hall she fared, swift as a swallow, noiseless as a bat, magically beautiful as only Tinuviel ever was, and now she was at Melko's side, now before him, now behind him, and her misty draperies touched his face and waved before his eyes, and the folk that sat about the walls or stood in that place were whelmed one by one in sleep, falling down into deep dreams of all that their ill hearts desired. Beneath his chair the adders lay like stones, and the wolves before his feet yawned and slumbered, and Melko gazed on enchanted, but he did not sleep. Then began Tinuviel to dance a yet swifter dance before his eyes, and even as she danced she sang in a voice very low and wonderful, a song which Gwyndoling had taught her long ago, a song that the youths and maidens sang beneath the cypresses of the gardens of Lorien, when the tree of gold had waned and Silpion was gleaming. The voices of nightingales were in it, and many subtle odours seemed to fill the air of that noisome place as she trod the floor lightly as a feather in the wind. Nor has any voice or sight of such beauty ever again been seen there, and I knew Melko, for all his power and majesty, succumbed to that magic of that elf maid. And indeed even the eyelids of Lorien had grown heavy, had he been there to see. Then did Melko fall forward, drowsed, and sank at last in utter sleep, down from his chair upon the floor, and his iron crown rolled away. Suddenly Tinuviel ceased. In the hall no sound was heard, save of slumberous breath. Even Beren slept beneath the very seat of Melko, but Tinuviel shook him, so that he awoke at last. Then in fear and trembling he tore asunder his disguise, and freeing himself from it leapt to his feet. Now does he draw that knife that he had from Tevildo's kitchens, and he seizes the mighty iron crown. But Tinuviel could not move it, and scarcely might the thews of Beren avail to turn it. Great is the frenzy of their fear, as in that dark hall of sleeping evil Beren labours as noiselessly as may be to prize out a Silmaril with his knife. Now does he loosen the great central jewel, and the sweat pours from his brow, but even as he forces it from the crown, lo! His knife snaps with a loud crack.
Tinuviel smothers a cry thereat, and Beren springs away with the one Silmaril in his hand, and the sleepers stir, and Melko groans as though ill thoughts disturbed his dreams, and a black look comes upon his sleeping face. Content now with that one flashing gem, those twain fled desperately from the hall, stumbling wildly down many dark passages, till from the glimmering of grey light they knew they had neared the gates. And behold, Karkaras lies across the threshold, awake once more and watchful. Straightway Beren thrust himself before Tinuviel, although she said him nay, and this proved in the end ill, for Tinuviel had not time to cast her spell of slumber over the beast again. Ere seeing Beren, he bared his teeth and growled angrily. "Wherefore this sureliness, Karkaras?" said Tinuviel. "Wherefore this gnome, who entered not, and yet now issueth in haste?" Quoth Knifefang, and with that he leapt upon Beren, who struck between the wolf's eyes with his fist, catching for his throat with the other. Then Karkaras seized that hand in his dreadful jaws, and it was the hand wherein Beren clasped the blazing Silmaril, and both hand and jewel Karkaras bit off, and took into his red maw. Great was the agony of Beren, and the fear and anguish of Tinuviel. Yet, even as they expect to feel the teeth of the wolf, a new thing, strange and terrible, comes to pass. Behold now, that Silmaril blazeth with a white and hidden fire of its own nature, and is possessed of a fierce and holy magic. For did it not come from Valinor and the blessed realms, being fashioned with spells of the gods and gnomes, before evil came there, and it doth not tolerate the touch of evil flesh, nor of unholy hand. Now cometh it into the foul body of Karkaras, and suddenly that beast is burnt with a terrible anguish, and the howling of his pain is ghastly to hear, as it echoeth in those rocky ways, so that all the sleeping court within wakes. Then do Tinuviel and Beren flee like the wind from the gates. Yet was Karkaras far before them, raging and in madness as a beast, pursued by Balrogs. And after when they might draw breath, Tinuviel wept over the maimed arm of Beren, kissing it often, so that behold it bled not, and pain left it, and was healed by the tender healing of her love. Yet was Beren ever after surnamed among all folk Ermabwed, the one-handed, which in the language of the Lonely Isle is Elmavoite. Now, however, must they bethink them of escape, if such may be their fortune. And Tinuviel wrapped part of her dark mantle about Beren, and so for a while, flitting by dusk and dark amid the hills, they were seen by none, albeit Melko had raised all his orcs of terror against them, and his fury at the rape of that jewel was greater than the elves had ever seen yet. Even so, it seemed soon to them that the net of hunters drew ever more tightly upon them, and though they had reached the edge of the more familiar woods, and passed the glooms of the forest of Tale of Tinuviel, still were there many leagues of peril yet to pass between them and the caverns of the king, and even did they reach ever there it seemed like they would but draw the chase behind them thither, and Melko's hate upon all that woodland folk. So great indeed was the hue and cry that Huan learnt of it far away, and he marvelled much at the daring of those twain, and still more that ever they had escaped from Angamundi. Now goes he with many dogs through the woods, hunting orcs and thanes of Tevildo, and many hurts he got thus, and many of them he slew, or put to fear and flight, until one even at dusk the Valar brought him to a glade in that northward region of Artanor that was called afterward Nandamgorthin, the land of the dark idols. But that is a matter that concerns not this tale. Howbeit, it was even then a dark land, and gloomy and foreboding, and dread wandered beneath its lowering trees, no less even than in Tale of Tinuviel, and those two elves, Tinuviel and Beren, were lying therein, weary and without hope, and Tinuviel wept, but Beren was fingering his knife. Now when Huan saw them, he would not suffer them to speak, nor to tell any of their tale, but straightway took Tinuviel upon his mighty back, and bade Beren run as best as he could beside him. "For," said he, "a great company of the orcs are drawing swiftly hither, and wolves are their trackers and their scouts." Now doth Juan's pack run about them, and they go very swiftly along quick and secret paths towards the homes of the folk of Tinwelint far away. Thus was it that they eluded the hosts of their enemies, but had none the less many an encounter afterward with wandering things of evil, and Beren slew an orc that came nigh to dragging of Tinuviel, and that was a good deed. Seeing then that the hunt still pressed them close, once more did Juan lead them by winding ways, and dared not yet straightly to bring them to the land of the woodland fairies. So cunning, however, was his leading, that at last, after many days, the chase fell far away, and no longer did they see or hear anything of the bands of orcs. No goblins waylaid them, nor did the howling of any evil wolves come upon the airs at night. And belike that was because already they had stepped within the circle of Gwendoling's magic that hid the paths from evil and kept harm from the regions of the wood elves. Then did Tinuviel breathe freely once more, as she had not done since she fled from her father's halls, and Beren rested in the sun, far from the glooms of Angband, until the last bitterness of thraldom left him. Because of the light falling through green leaves, and the whisper of clean winds, and the song of birds once more, are they wholly unafraid. At last came there, nevertheless, a day whereon, waking out of a deep slumber, Beren started up as one who leaves a dream of happy things coming suddenly to his mind, and he said, "Farewell, O Juan, most trusty comrade, and thou, little Tinuviel, whom I love. Fare thee well, this only I beg of thee. Get thee now straight to the safety of thy home, and may good Juan lead thee. But lo, I must away into the solitude of the woods, for I have lost that Silmaril which I had, and never dare I draw near to Angamundi more, wherefore neither will I enter the halls of Tinwelint." Then he wept to himself, but Tinuviel, who was nigh and had hearkened to his musing, came beside him and said, "Nay, now is my heart changed. And if thou dwellest in the woods, O Beren Mabwed, then so will I. And if thou wilt wander in the wild places, there will I wander also, or with thee, or after thee. Yet never shall my father see me again, save only if thou takest me to him." Then indeed was Beren glad of her sweet words, and fain would he have dwelt with her as a huntsman of the wild, but his heart smote him for all that she had suffered for him, and for her he put away his pride. Indeed, she reasoned with him, saying it would be folly to be stubborn, and that her father would greet them with naught but joy, being glad to see his daughter yet alive. "And maybe," said she, "he will have shame that his jesting has given thy fair hand to the jaws of Karkaras." But Juan also she implored to return with them a space. "For my father owes thee a very great reward, O Juan," saith she, "and he loves his daughter at all." So came it that those three set forward once again together, and came at last back to the woodlands that Tinuviel knew and loved, nigh to the dwellings of her folk, and to the deep halls of her home. Yet even as they approach, they find fear and tumult among that people, such as had not been seen for a long age. And asking some that wept before their doors, they learn that ever since the day of Tinuviel's secret flight, ill fortune had befallen them. Lo, the king had been distraught with grief, and had relaxed his ancient wariness and cunning. Indeed, his warriors had been sent hither and thither deep into the unwholesome woods, searching for that maiden. And many had been slain or lost forever, and war there was with Melko's servants about all their northern and eastern borders, so that the folk feared mightily lest that Ainu upraise his strength and come utterly to crush them, and Gwendoling's magic have not the strength to withhold the numbers of the orcs. "Behold," said they, "now is the worst of all befallen, for long has Queen Gwyndoling sat aloof, and smiled not nor spoken, looking as it were to a great distance with haggard eyes, and the web of her magic has blown thin about the woods, and the woods are dreary, for Dairon comes not back, neither is his music heard ever in the glades. Behold now the crown of all our evil tidings, for know that there has broken upon us, raging from the halls of evil, a great grey wolf, filled with an evil spirit, and he fears as though lashed by some hidden madness, and none are safe. Already has he slain many, as he runs wildly, snapping and yelling through the woods, so that the very banks of the stream that flows before the king's halls has become a lurking place of danger. There comes the awful wolf, oftentimes to drink, looking as the evil prince himself, with bloodshot eyes and tongue lolling out, and never can he slake his desire for water, as though some inward fire devours him. Then was Tinuviel sad at the thought of the unhappiness that had come upon her folk, and most of all was her heart bitter at the story of Dairon, for of this she had not heard any murmur before. Yet could she not wish Beren had come never to the lands of Artenor, and together they made haste to Tinwelint, and already to the elves of the wood it seemed that the evil was at an end now, that Tinuviel was come back among them unharmed. Indeed, they scarce had hoped for that. In great grey gloom did they find King Tinwelint, yet suddenly his sorrow melted to tears of gladness, and Gwyndoling sings again for joy when Tinuviel enters there, and casting away her raiment of dark mist, she stands before them in her pearly radiance of old. For a while all is mirth and wonder in that hall, and yet at length the king turns his eyes to Beren and says, "So thou hast returned too, bringing a Silmaril beyond doubt, in recompense for all the ill thou hast wrought upon my land. Or, an thou hast not, I know not wherefore thou art here." Then Tinuviel stamped her foot and cried, so that the king and all about him wondered at her new and fearless mood. "For shame, my father! Behold, here is Beren the brave, whom thy jesting drove into dark places and foul captivity, and the valour alone saved from a bitter death. Methinks 'twould rather befit a king of the Eldar to reward him than revile him." "Nay," said Beren, "the king thy father hath the right, lord," said he. "I have a Silmaril in my hand, even now." "Show me then," said the king in amaze. "That I cannot," said Beren, "for my hand is not here." And he held forth his maimed arm. Then was the king's heart turned to him by reason of his stout and courteous demeanour. And he bid Beren and Tinuviel relate to him all that had befallen either of them, and he was eager to hearken, for he did not fully comprehend the meaning of Beren's words. When, however, he had heard all, yet more was his heart turned to Beren, and he marvelled at the love that had awakened in the heart of Tinuviel, so that she had done greater deeds and more daring than any of the warriors of his folk. "Never again," said he, "O Beren, I beg of thee, never leave this court nor the side of Tinuviel, for thou art a great elf, and thy name will ever be great among the kindreds." Yet Beren answered him proudly and said, "Nay, O king, I hold to my word and thine, and I will get thee that Silmaril, or ever I dwell in peace in thy halls." And the king entreated him to journey no more into the dark and unknown realms. But Beren said, "No need is there thereof, for behold, that jewel is even now nigh to thy caverns." And he made clear to Tinwelint that that beast that ravaged his land was none other than Karkaras, the wolf ward of Melko's gates. And this was not known to all, but Beren knew it taught by Huan, whose cunning in the reading of track and slot was greatest among all the hounds, and therein are none of them unskilled. Huan indeed was with Beren now in the halls, and when those twain spoke of a great chase and a great hunt, he begged to be in that deed, and it was granted gladly. Now do those three prepare themselves to harry that beast, that all the folk be rid of the terror of the wolf. And Beren keep his word, bringing a Silmaril to shine once more in Elfeness. King Tinwelint himself led that chase, and Beren was beside him, and Mablung, the heavy-handed chief of the king's thanes, leapt up and grasped a spear, a mighty weapon captured in battle with the distant orcs. And with those three stalked Huan, mightiest of dogs. But others they would not take according to the desire of the king, who said, "4 is enough for the slaying even of the hell wolf." But only those who had seen knew how fearsome was that beast, nigh as large as a horse among men, and so great was the ardour of his breath that it scorched whatsoever it touched. About the hour of sunrise they set forth, and soon after Juan espied a new slot beside the stream, not far from the king's doors. "And," quoth he, "this is the print of Karkaras." Thereafter they followed that stream all day, and at many places its banks were new trampled and torn, and the water of the pools that lay about it was fouled, as though some beast possessed of madness had rolled and fought there not long before. Now sinks the sun, and fades beyond the western trees, and darkness is creeping down from Hislume, so that the light of the forest dies. Even so they come to a place where the spoor swerves from the stream, or perchance is lost in its waters, and Juan may no longer follow it. And here therefore they encamp, sleeping in turns beside the stream, and the early night wears away. Suddenly, in Beren's watch, a sound of great terror leapt up from far away, a howling as of 70 maddened wolves. Then lo! the brushwood cracks and saplings snap as the terror draweth near, and Beren knows that Karkaras is upon them. Scarce had he time to rouse the others, and they were but just sprung up and half awake, when a great form loomed in the wavering moonlight filtering there, and it was fleeing like one mad, and its course was bent towards the water. Thereat Juan gave tongue, and straightway the beast swerved aside towards them, and foam was dripping from his jaws, and a red light shining from his eyes, and his face was marred with mingled terror and with wrath. No sooner did he leave the trees than Juan rushed upon him, fearless of heart. But he, with a mighty leap, sprang right over that great dog, for all his fury was kindled suddenly against Beren, whom he recognized as he stood behind, and to his dark mind it seemed that there was the cause of all his agony. Then Beren thrust swiftly upward with a spear into his throat, and Juan leapt again, and had him by a hind leg, and Karkaras fell like a stone, for at that same moment the king's spear found his heart, and his evil spirit gushed forth, and sped, howling faintly as it fared over the dark hills, to Mandos. But Beren lay under him, crushed beneath his weight. Now they roll back that carcass, and fall to cutting it open. But Juan licks Beren's face whence blood is flowing. Soon is the truth of Beren's words made clear, for the vitals of the wolf are half consumed, as though an inner fire had long been smouldering there, and suddenly the night is filled with a wondrous lustre, shot with pale and secret colours, as Mablung draws forth the Silmaril. Then holding it out he said, "Behold, O king!" But Tinwelint said, "Nay, never will I handle it, save only if Beren give it to me." But Juan said, "And that seems likely never to be, unless ye tend him swiftly, for methinks he is hurt sorely." And Mablung and the king were ashamed. Therefore now they raised Beren gently up, and tended him, and washed him, and he breathed. But he spoke not, nor opened his eyes. And when the sun arose, and they had rested a little, they bore him as softly as might be upon a bier of boughs, back through the woodlands. And nigh midday they drew near the homes of the folk again, and then were they deadly weary, and Beren had not moved nor spoken, but groaned thrice. There did all the people flock to meet them, when their approach was noised among them. And some bore them meat and cool drinks, and salves, and healing things for their hurts. But for the harm that Beren had met, great indeed had been their joy. Now then they covered the leafy boughs whereon he lay with soft raiment, and they bore him away to the halls of the king, and there was Tinuviel awaiting them in great distress, and she fell upon Beren's breast and wept and kissed him, and he awoke and knew her. And after Mablung gave him that Silmaril, and he lifted it above him, gazing at its beauty, ere he said slowly and with pain, "Behold, O king, I give thee the wondrous jewel thou didst desire, and it is but a little thing found by the wayside, for once, methinks thou hadst one beyond thought more beautiful, and she is now mine." Yet even as he spake, the shadows of Mandos lay upon his face, and his spirit fled in that hour to the margin of the world, and Tinuviel's tender kisses called him back not. Here Veanna suddenly ceased speaking, but she wept, and after a while she said, Nay, that is not all the tale, but here endeth all that I rightly know. In the conversation that followed, one Aesir said, I have heard that the magic of Tinuviel's tender kisses healed Beren, and recalled his spirits from the gates of Mandos, and long time he dwelt among the lost elves. But another said, Nay, that was not so, O Aesir, and if thou wilt listen I will tell the true and wondrous tale. For Beren died there in Tinuviel's arms, even as Viannas has said, and Tinuviel, crushed with sorrow, and finding no comfort nor light in all the world, followed him swiftly down those dark ways that all must tread alone. Now, her beauty and tender loveliness touched even the cold heart of Mandos, so that he suffered her to lead Beren forth once more into the world. Nor has this ever been done since to man nor elf, and many songs and stories are there of the prayer of Tinuviel before the throne of Mandos, that I remember not right well. Yet said Mandos to those twain, Lo, O elves, it is not to any life of perfect joy that I dismiss you, for such may no longer be found in all the world where sits Melko of the evil heart. And know that ye will become mortal even as men, and when ye fare hither again, it'll be for ever, unless the gods summon you indeed to Valinor. Nonetheless those twain departed hand in hand, and they fared together through the northern woods, and oftentimes were they seen dancing magic dances down the hills, and their name became heard far and wide. Then Vianna said, Ay, and they did more than dance, for their deeds afterward were very great. And many tales are there thereof that thou must hear, O Eriol Melinon, upon another time of tale-telling. For these twain it is that story's name Equirathon, which is to say, the dead that live again, and they become mighty fairies in the lands about the north of Sirion. Behold now, all is ended, and doth like it thee? Then Eriol said that he had not expected to hear such an astonishing story from one such as Vianne, to which she answered, Nay, but I fashioned it not with words of myself, but it is dear to me, and indeed all the children know of the deeds that it relates, and I have learned it by heart, reading it in the great books, and I do not comprehend all that is set therein.